Welcome back to As Told by You. We have got a cool guest today. There are some guests I think that I am surprised that we get, and then there's guys like Sean who I really wanted to get on from the very beginning. I was like, if I'm going to talk to interesting people in Columbia, I think Sean is one of the more interesting people in Columbia. Sean is a photojournalist. I've seen him at so many different things, events, things like St. Pat's and 5 Points, but then also at New Brooklyn Tavern sometimes. And then you see pictures of him, scaling crazy things, or like trudging into hurricane ravaged area, or wading through a flood with his cameras above his head, or paddling through a neighborhood, walking with protest. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that you see him doing. And so it's very cool to have you on. Sean, tell us what you're doing now, and talk about what it is you do.
Well, right now, I guess I'm juggling a lot of things, like a lot of people probably are. My work is probably less than 50% in photojournalism, and then the rest in commercial photography, and then other random types of visual storytelling. Last year, I did 2 videos on airplanes for an aircraft broker. And this is for a freelance photojournalist, which is what I am, this is pretty typical for anyone in the field these days. There's probably no freelance photojournalist that just does photojournalism.
Yeah.
And especially like in an area here in South Carolina. If you were in New York or DC or Los Angeles, you might be able to pull something like that off, but you're probably still also going to be doing other things because those opportunities are also there.
You have to make 4 times as much money.
Right, to live in those
Yes.
areas. Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. And so I've always juggled this dynamic of trying to find the different types of work. But the documentary work, which photojournalism is what I'm most interested in. And I do a lot of personal documentary projects to kind of fulfill the need to do that type of work when the photojournalism work isn't there.
Gotcha. Well, tell me what brought you to this work. Why photography, and why photojournalism specifically?
So I guess I was in high school and a junior, and I had a darkroom photo class. There wouldn't have been a digital version available at that time. And I just gotten my license. And I drove to the local park to take photographs of ducks for the project.
Yeah,
the photo
high school project. Yeah.
And on the way back, at like the second to last turn to my house, came across an accident that involved just a regular car and a 18-wheeler carrying asphalt or something of that type of material. And it was just this really bad accident, and had film in the camera. And literally, like, I couldn't not get past it back to my house without going past it. And so I photographed it, and then that ended up being way more interesting than the ducks at the pond.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then senior year in high school, we went in Maryland to a 4-period day for the first time. I don't know how they do it now these days in high school. But
I'm not sure I could tell you.
We had like 8-period day. You had 8 different classes, 8 subjects. You moved around a lot. And then my senior year switched to 4 classes in one day, longer class periods. And then they were going to get rid of the newspaper because they couldn't have, they didn't have a teacher who they could give that much of a quarter of their day to newspaper. And then 2 of my classmates were like, no, we're going to make this work. And they found a teacher who would be like she would do that as part of her planning period. And then they recruited me as the photographer. And the editor was at her senior year. She did a internship at the Baltimore Sun. So she was like in high school working at a huge daily newspaper.
Right.
And then one of the stories that I remember that I did that really got me into it was a lot of times I would pitch or write my own stories so that I could photograph the things that I wanted to photograph. And I wrote a story about the Bloodhound Gang in 1997 for my high school newspaper, which, like, that was pretty good access. They had a hit song on the radio, and they let me hang out on their bus all day, invited me to a show the next night in Baltimore.
It's like Almost Famous. I was about to say.
I mean, it turned into me making a fake Rolling Stone press pass within 90 days, and that was before that movie came out. And I lived in between Baltimore and D.C. Basically, not necessarily in between, but kind of
Enough, yeah.
And your parents were just cool with you going to
Well,
hang out with rock bands
so-
at 17 years old?
so
Especially the
first,
Bloodhound Gang, because they don't have the reputation for being like.
Oh, they wouldn't even.
Sweethearts.
They couldn't even exist now.
No.
Like they
were very
can't
much not
exist now.
PC. Yeah.
Yeah, but so the first interaction that I had was this event called the HFS Snow Job, and that was put on by WHFS, the big modern rock, alt rock station, that served Baltimore and DC, and it was at the bottom of a ski resort. The stage was, you could snowboard or ski down, pick
Wow.
up the lift, and while you were waiting on the lift, you could watch a band play, and the stage would be there, and people were hanging out like a regular concert.
Yeah.
And it was the Bloodhound Gang and Jimmy's Chicken Shack, and Jimmy's Chicken Shack was from Maryland,
Yeah.
so that made sense. And then it was the Money Money Boss Tones and Local H.
Wow.
And then
That's such a 90s bill right
Yep.
there.
The fact
Yeah.
that you can remember exactly what
Yeah.
the bands were is pretty cool.
and so I a few days before the show, so my brother was a snowboard instructor at the ski resort. And so I emailed the guitar player from Bloodhound Gang, because that's like, you just went to their website and like, that's how it worked back then. This would have been 96, I believe. So 97, I think.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, my brother works at the ski resort. If you guys want lessons, like, he can hook you up.
Nice.
And like we like went back and forth, and they were like, yeah, that sounds cool, like maybe we can do that. And then like a few days before it, I also emailed them. I was like, oh, so I work for my high school newspaper, can I write a story about you guys? And they were like, yeah, great, meet our manager at the ski resort hotel at 10 a.m. day of the show. And so it was like an all day thing. So like that was nothing for me to go to. That was just like a day concert.
Right.
And then the next night they played in Baltimore and Fells Point at a place called Fletcher's. And this was also at the time, not quite yet. I'm going to get ahead of myself there. And I ended up on the guest list for that show, and then convincing my parents to let me go to that was a big ask. And a bunch of my friends happened to be going to Baltimore that night to celebrate one of their birthdays. And so my thing was that I was going to go with my friends, go out to dinner to the Cheesecake Factory, and then they would like help me find my way to the to the club. And that's how I kind of got to that. And then from then on, a lot of the times it was whenever the Bloodhound Gang would come back in town, that area, and they were super popular at that time. Had a good relationship with that radio station, so they kept coming back. A few months later, they came back and played another festival, and it was like Redman and Nerf Herder and George Clinton.
Wow.
And that was the beauty of like Baltimore, D.C.
Yeah.
was that like it was a variety of stuff going on.
That's a wild set.
And so I started finding that like, oh, I could have these amazing experiences that all my friends couldn't have. And then like in school itself, I could walk around and it was like a hall pass.
Mm-hmm.
No one would ask me like what I was doing because they just
You had
got
the
used
camera.
to me. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so very quickly it was like, oh, wow, I can do all of these things that
Yeah.
like no one else gets to do.
So what brought you to Columbia?
I wanted to go somewhere warmer for school.
Okay.
To college. Came as a computer science major.
Oh.
Got accepted to Florida. Got accepted, and then my final choices were Florida, South Carolina, College of Charleston, and East Carolina.
Okay.
Coming down from Maryland.
Yeah.
And Florida was Gainesville was an hour and a half from where my parents were retiring to.
Right.
So I'd be moving 14 hours away from home to be an hour and a half away from my parents.
Right.
And the dorm rooms that we toured didn't have air conditioning. According to my dad's recollection of the tour. I don't
Yeah.
remember that, but that would have played.
That's a dad thing to remember, though.
That
Yeah.
would have played probably. He would have talked about that. That would have influenced me. And then South Carolina, when I came here, I liked the town and this fact that it was in a city. Because I lived in the country, even though it was between Baltimore and D.C. I lived with a cornfield behind my house.
Yeah.
On a cul-de-sac with a farm and a pond on the other side. One of my best friends lived on a farm.
Yeah.
But you could go, a half an hour to 10 different malls.
Right.
So, yeah, I liked the fact that it was a city, but it wasn't like a giant
Right.
metro
You couldn't
area.
get out of it.
And that it was warmer.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything about South Carolina. Like, I didn't know anything about the Gamecocks. My first college football game was my first week here when they asked me to cover college football, and I was like,
Right.
okay, sure, that sounds. It was just another one of those things where I walked out on the Williams-Brice, and I was like, holy shit,
Yeah.
wow, this is different.
Yeah.
Because I was always into sports. I was vice president varsity club. Going to Baltimore Orioles games, Frederick Keys, which is minor league, baseball in Frederick. A lot of indoor hockey, indoor soccer, basketball games. Got to see Michael Jordan play. Sat next to Allen Iverson when he was. But I had never been to a stadium that had like 80,000 people in it, and that was something that was before.
Considering the
unreal.
population of Columbia is still about 150,000, that's pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to somebody about that the other day. Like, how do we get 80,000 people into that stadium if only 150,000 people live here?
It takes all of the highway patrol.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a crazy thing. Why? So what encouraged you to stay here? So obviously you went to University of South Carolina. You seem to be somebody who is going to, based on the Bloodhound Gang story, you're just going to go where you need to go.
Yeah.
So why Columbia? Why stay here?
Why didn't I leave? So changed my major quickly. I joined the college newspaper first week. And then I probably, up through my senior year, probably thought that I wouldn't have anything to do with newspapers and wouldn't be a photojournalist and like probably more likely be like a magazine photographer, that looked a lot more glamorous and attractive.
More money.
Yeah. And got a job at Sounds Familiar record store. And first semester out of college, worked on my own game day college football publication. It was a newsprint about the size of the Free Times, where like the Free Times used to be. And the editor my senior year. He, how do I say this? They passed him over to be the editor his senior year. He was a junior because he endorsed a student government candidate, and that was like against the bylaws of the student newspaper at the time. And his argument was like, we can't be an accredited student newspaper by like the big university.
Your editor had bias.
unless we do this thing. And so he like pushed that and did it, and then they were like, we're done with you.
Wow.
And then he needed like something to do, and he convinced me to start his game day publication, and it was mainly about Gamecock sports, but it was specifically addressed for that game day. Mm-hmm. So whoever we played, and had like a crew of folks that were students and ex-students that I knew from the newspaper, and probably even Garnet and Black even, and they helped work on it. We we did it like all on university equipment, like in the Coliseum basement at like 2 a.m.
Yeah.
And then we got it published, printed at the Newberry Observer, and we would, I had a radio flyer, and I would just walk around and pass them out, and I sold ads, and did all that stuff. And so that kind of kept me there, and I was still working at Sounds Familiar. And then I got a job working at New Brooklyn, and I was working at New Brooklyn and Sounds Familiar. Started looking for newspaper jobs, and no job that I had a realistic expectation to get had a music scene that existed. Mm-hmm. So the newspaper jobs were in like Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
Oh, right.
And I'd go to like Polestar.
Mm-hmm.
For folks our age, know what Polestar is. It used to be like this giant database of concerts, and you could go look up any town and find it quite quickly, and all the jobs that were available, there was no bands ever coming through those towns that I wanted to see. So I was like, no, don't want that job. And those were the entry-level jobs at the time.
Yeah.
And so basically I just stayed here.
That's cool.
And then bartended at New Brooklyn for over a decade. And that was like a decade ago.
That might have been probably where I met you originally.
Most
was
likely.
bartending at New Brooklyn.
That's where most people have met me.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you chose newspaper jobs based on what concerts came through. So I think that's not normally something somebody would choose their job based on, right? But I think anybody in the music scene in Columbia would find it fascinating that you stayed here. Because it doesn't seem like now there is a thriving music scene here. Obviously, I mean you and I know that well, but like I don't think the reputation of Columbia is of a thriving music scene. Talk about kind of okay. So you did you ever take the newspaper? Do you ever get a newspaper job? I mean, is it?
So when I was working at Sounds Familiar, someone who worked in the newsroom was married to the manager, mm-hmm. and connected me with the photo editor, Chuck Dye at the time, and was like, hey, if you're interested in this, we'll connect you with him. And I was like, great. So I went down, brought a portfolio. It was all concert photography, because that was all that I had physically to show anyone.
Right.
Because I couldn't just show someone on my phone or a digital portfolio.
Yeah, right, sure.
I don't think we had CD burners at that time. I don't know, but I had physical things.
Yeah.
And he said, well, we'll see if you can photograph a football game, high school
right.
football game. And so I went out and photographed high school football, and I freelanced with the state newspaper, and I was around all these great photojournalists at the time. And then after doing that, post-college, maybe a year after freelancing with them, Chuck was like, hey, do you want to do this summer internship? Mm-hmm. And I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. And he was like, yeah, I don't have to like go through all these applications.
Yeah, just bring you on.
Bring you on. Someone's familiar with everything already. So I did an internship at the state newspaper, got done with that, and then immediately continued freelancing with them. And because I had just done, an internship, I was very much in the general workings of getting assignments. And so, I got up a lot of assignments and continued to do that for a while. Stopped doing that at one point with the state, ended up being the creative director at the Columbia City paper, which was an alt weekly that existed maybe for 4 years. And
I remember the Columbia
it
City
was
paper.
very much alternative. When I say, alt weekly, we would have cover stories that a lot of people wouldn't really go after. One of the big stories that we did was on Bay Rutherford, who owned Bay's and Pop's Pizza down in 5 Points. And someone tipped us off to him because there was an episode of Forensic Files about Bay Rutherford and how he had basically he had faked his own death, used a body in Mexico, and then stole the life savings of an elderly next door neighbor of his.
How did I not hear about I didn't hear about this at all. That's crazy.
And so we did a cover story about how this guy had opened up a pizza shop in 5 Points.
I remember Pop's Pizza, though.
Yep.
Yeah.
That guy changed his name. He had aliases.
Crazy.
And he was also doing things, supposedly.
This was a true story?
Yeah.
The guy that owned Pop Pizza did all that?
Yeah.
Yep. Bay Rutherford. And he, talked to anyone who worked at his establishments. They will say horrible things about how he did business, how he paid people, what you drank when you ordered something, whether it was actually that thing that you ordered it in that bottle. But it was my responsibility to figure out the cover, the visual to represent that. And we had so many of these stories that I couldn't really they didn't want us in there, and couldn't get a portrait of them.
Right.
And it needed to be an engaging story. So I started using Playmobil toys.
Oh, okay.
And I couldn't find Playmobil toys for this cover, but for this I got a pink Barbie Corvette. And then there was that movie with about the comic book character who rode the motorcycle that was on fire, I think.
You talking about Ghost Rider?
Yes. Yeah. And so I bought that toy character and I put him in the car, and then I photographed that. And then there was another story about an affair between local politicians, and I had a bedroom scene.
That's awesome.
And we would get taken out of certain establishments.
Yeah.
I remember Zesto's removed us because I think of that cover because it was a sex scene with Playmobil toys.
Yeah. You don't necessarily want that in your Zestos, I guess. That makes sense. So
yeah, I've bounced around.
That's awesome. I think it's so interesting how that's developed into kind of what you're doing now, which I think has maybe if I'm misunderstanding, but it has a similar vibe. Just let's just do the thing that needs to be done, right?
And right now I've got my hands in everything.
Yeah. And I love to watch kind of what you're up to online. I guess I see it mostly through Facebook as much as anything, but I remember I don't remember what hurricane it was, but there was some hurricane that happened in Florida, and you went down there with your kayak.
That was the first time I bought a kayak.
Yeah, and took the kayak into the flooded area with this camera to get shots of the hurricane. It just goes places where other people just won't go or can't go or don't go to get the shot. Talk about the drive for that. What is it that drives you to do that?
Curiosity. I think that's one thing that photojournalists and journalists all share is this intense curiosity. It's I like windy roads and mountains because I'm not sure what's going to be around the next corner. I like that surprise. If I go kayaking, I want to kayak on like Cedar Creek, which is a little teeny windy creek,
Yeah.
as opposed to like the Broad River
Right.
in this area where it would just be like
Straight and flat, you know exactly where it's going. Yeah.
and so it's it's definitely the attraction to that, and probably the early exposure to seeing things that surprised me.
Yeah.
And finding things that I never knew that I would be interested in.
Right.
Be like, oh wow, this is interesting. I didn't know about this. And then, you know, it's human nature to slow down when we pass an accident.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely part of it. And then there's the challenge part that you start to understand, and then that kind of becomes, you know, a game or a sport or, you know, whatever it is where that like you, it's a way that you can stand out and do something that no one else is doing, is just by, you know, putting forth different types of effort.
Yeah.
And that hurricane would have been Irma,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have a kayak before that. That's why I bought a kayak. and
That's come in handy though, right?
yeah,
You know?
I haven't used it as much, but for a number of hurricanes, especially in the coastal storms, as opposed to when they go up into the mountains, you get river flooding,
Yeah.
and that's where they come in into play. I never used them in flash floods.
Right.
Most of the time, it'll sit up on the roof of my van for days and days and days, and then it comes off when the rivers start to do their flooding, and then it'll be the slow creeping flood that inundates. And sometimes it'll be the same neighborhoods that got, you know, flooded before, as just a different type, because the flash flood is just I have
Kinda
no
comes
I have
up
no
and
I have no
goes away.
business being out there in those scenarios. And then also too, it's logistically hard to be there at that time.
To get there.
Yeah, like that's also, you know, the big part of the challenge is just getting there, and that has always been the big logistical challenge, or the big challenge of covering storms, is getting in the right spot, even when we have a good forecast of it, because even if you're right where the storm makes landfall, that doesn't mean that's where it has the biggest impact.
Sure.
And that was really obvious with Helene.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, so you got a lot of access in Hurricane Helene that other people didn't get. Talk about that a little bit, and what was kind of the decision to just go? Was that somebody assigned you, or did you just decided to go?
So over the last few years, I'd say the last maybe 3 or 4 years, I have gotten my van into a build in which I can live and work out of for weeks at a time. I don't know. I maybe a month. Maybe long. I mean, I could do it longer. It gets annoying though. I have a home. I don't need to do that. But I've gotten to a point where I have a vehicle that I don't need a hotel room. I don't need power. I'm completely self-sustainable. I've got Starlink now. I've had that for a few years. And so I've gotten enough relationships with the people that I work with that I can just kind of go and then get myself in a close enough position and then let them know, hey, I'm here.
I'm here. I'm going to go get some shots.
And with every storm over the last 4 years that's come up through the Gulf, it's been a Category 2 or larger, bigger, stronger. They've gone through rapid intensification, and they end up as like a 4 or 5. And so what's happened is I leave to go, and it's a 2 when I leave. And by the time I start getting in that area the next day or 12 hours later, it's a 3 or a 4, or there's forecast for it to be that way. And then the folks that I'm working with, which is typically Getty, they've got staffers that they've put out in position already, but now it's become this bigger storm.
And they can't get there, and you're already there.
And and then 1 year I was the lead visual correspondent for the Washington Post for the Atlantic coast, and then no hurricanes hit the Atlantic coast that year. And they gave me we had like an agreement where I would give them first right of refusal, I believe is the term. But most of all my work with these scenarios have come through Getty, and then all the recent storms that I've covered have been scenarios where I've just packed up my gear and left.
Knowing it was going to happen.
And part of, the job of the journalist and the challenge is like to be aware of whatever's going on, and, to have resources that you can be like, oh, okay, I feel good about this, and to know like where you can go and be safe. But to give you an example of how it's worked the last two storms. So I covered Helene. That was the longest storm that I, from like beginning to end that I put in, because of the area that it impacted, and because I started before it made landfall, photographing people preparing.
Right.
I covered that, I don't know, 8-9 days, whatever it was, 10 days. And then I came back home, tried to like regroup, and then I had done some fundraising for Batcave, and I was able to buy a couple generators, take them up to Batcave, and then I was going to spend a day or two back up in Batcave and kind of continue the storytelling. But then Hurricane Milton started coming up, and I was like, man, I need to pay attention to that. And then I was like, all right, I got to go back to Columbia and prepare if that comes through. So on my way back, after dropping off those generators, I emailed my editors at Getty, and I was like, hey, I'm heading back to Columbia so I can prepare for Milton. And they were like, my one editor emailed me back, and she said, you need a break. like we've got blah, 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 and blah, blah coming down from New York and Washington. We got it covered. And I was like, all right, cool. Damn it. It's like, all right, now I got to like get on the horn and email the other folks that like the Washington Post and the New York Times, and try to get a gig with somebody else, try to get an assignment with somebody else. None of that panned out. I was like, all right, I'm going anyway. Like, I left North Carolina. I packed all my stuff. Like, this is what I wait all year to do.
Right.
And so I drove down to Tampa. And I got into Tampa, and I emailed, there's 3 assignment editors at Getty that I normally work with, and I emailed them all 3, and it was just like, hey, I'm in Tampa if you need me. And like I got an email back about an hour later, and they were like, all right, yeah, that sounds great. We can use you.
Nice. So now you got to go back.
And so then at that point, then we coordinate where each of us are going to be so that we don't overlap. Mm-hmm. And I ended up in Saras. Oh, I'm getting them mixed up now. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm getting Milton.
So many storms.
This year, at one point, I was in the same parking garage that I was in for a previous hurricane. And
well, talk about Chimney Rock a little bit, because I followed that like it was something I was doing. Like every day you posted about going somewhere else, I'm telling everybody like, holy crap, Sean Rayford is walking into Chimney Rock, like just to make sure that someone's there to document it.
So I left Florida in Steinhatchee, which is about 30 miles from where it made landfall on the Gulf. I left the day after landfall at like 9 o'clock. I drove to the Georgia border, woke up that morning, Valdosta, I think, so that I could get some photos and a dateline from Georgia, and then beelined up to Asheville. The same idea, to get into Asheville and to have some photos for the wire service that have the Asheville dateline, because that's the main city and that's where most of the stories are going to be about. Right. And in the process and the travel and listening to the radio and the TV on my phone, and looking at Twitter and social media when I'm getting gas and taking breaks, I saw a lot of just looked like ridiculous rumors specifically about Chimney Rock. And so that was immediately like, oh, I got to go to Chimney Rock because people were just saying it's gone. And like, that's the type of hyperbolic communication that happens a lot of the time in disasters. And if it's gone, then those are photographs that, that need to be made, and like someone needs to report that back. And so that kind of became like this kind of goal. And that's typically how the storm coverage works is you ride the storm out somewhere, and then you have a goal or two. Normally that's...
Get out alive.
Well, yeah, but to show what people are talking about, right?
To get to the areas that's affected the worst. And so like there was the one storm that I covered in Louisiana. The two staffers, one of them came down with COVID, and then the other one had to return because they were in a hotel together, and I was the last person in Louisiana. And then the goal was to get to Grand Isle, which is about 20 miles from where it made landfall. And if you know anything about Louisiana, Grand Isle is like the bottom of Louisiana. It's as far south as you can get in like the Gulf in that area. And like 6 days after the storm hit, no one was allowed on Grand Isle.
Right.
And so a lot of times you'll have these goals to get, and they may be days away. And that's how Chimney Rock was. And then the idea is like, okay, you'll find intermediate towns, areas, goals along the way.
Right.
And sometimes you get to that final goal. I didn't know if I was ever going to get to Chimney Rock. I wasn't sure. But I knew that I had lots of days because on my drive up, my editors asked me if I would be available until like that Friday. And that was the most days that I'd ever been asked to cover anything in advance.
Right.
And so I knew that like, okay, like the devastation's really bad. We're investing, long-term coverage in this. And so I didn't have to be like, okay, I need to get there immediately. I knew that like a lot of the storytelling was going to be the places in between and the process getting there.
Right.
And so then I guess once I left Asheville, it was just trying to get to Chimney Rock.
Right.
And then it was at that point, that's talking with people on the ground mainly.
Like which place can I go to? Like what's there?
What roads are actually still intact? What's blocked? Because there's a difference between like what's intact and what's blocked.
Because you can go around a blockage.
So, yeah, sometimes that's the case, depending upon the reason that it's blocked.
Right.
Like if there's no earth underneath the asphalt up ahead, then that's a good reason to not go around that blockage.
Right.
And so you have to like get out and find out why the road is blocked whenever you come up to it in these, because it'll be blocked and like there's still maybe a story 2 or 3 miles up the road, but that's where the road is actually gone. And they don't want regular traffic trying to get to that area. And so like the roadblocks don't really apply to what I'm doing, even though they do apply to what I'm doing. And in the process of just trying to find my way to Chimney Rock, I quickly started reading all these stories about these people that were hiking in, checking on their loved ones. And I was just like, well, that's what you do. I covered a storm in Florida where I paddled through the like back estuary to a beach community that I couldn't get into past a police roadblock. You figure out like how to get there. And my thought was like, oh, well, like that actually kind of sounds interesting and way more feasible than trying to get across one of 2 bridges that lead to a barrier island. Because most times when you're covering storms on the coast, where you're trying to get where it's most affected are these barrier islands, and most time you can't get there because there's a bridge and then there's a police
Yeah, blocking the
blockade,
bridge.
and they're
Yeah.
not letting anybody pass.
Right.
And that may be for days, but like if you can like hike into a place, and the police presence wasn't as yeah, it was like in the beach communities, it's so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you get like closer to the water and it gets worse. Where with Helene and Western North Carolina, you know, it followed the tributaries. And the dynamics of that were just completely different in how you got into the areas, and you had the ability to hike in.
Yeah.
And you could hike in through a road. And you know, you might have to leave the road at times and go through the woods or through a riverbed. But I, you know, started reading these stories of how random people were doing that. And then I came up on a landslide 2 miles from Bat Cave, and that's how the search and rescue teams were doing their jobs. And then I was like, oh, well,
Here's
how
something
do
else.
you tell their stories?
Right.
You got to hike in with them, and then that's how you get to the places. And so the stories are about the people that are hiking into these places, and then the places that they're going to. So it makes sense for me as a photojournalist to that be my role, especially someone who, as opposed to, you know, a day and age we live in where photography has been democratized, along with publishing, news media, and people can be citizen journalists in their own neighborhoods. But I've got Starlink on me. I can hike in and out and send it, and I'm connected, you know, with all of these new international news entities. So there's this different role that I have and understand, and an excuse,
Yeah.
if that makes sense, to do it. And because you start getting to know how to do it and get good at, then the excuse makes more sense to do it.
And I think too that there's no duplicating your drive, right? So whether people can do it or not, they don't do it, right?
Well, yeah, it takes a different type of mentality.
But that aside, though, what are there things that you look for when you get to an event or a scenario or a concert, or in order to tell stories through photographs? Since we tell stories all the time with what we do, social media for businesses, for example, is telling their story through a series of photos over a long period of time, right? That's all it is. But you have a very specific event or something that's happening that you want to tell that specific story. So do you have any tips or something that you focus in on to say, when I get to X, Y, and Z,
Sure.
I want to make sure I capture these 4 things, and those 4 things will help me tell the full story?
Yeah. So with me, a lot of times I come to into a scenario where I don't know how the story ends, and that's like one of the biggest challenges that at least I think I personally face in storytelling is I come into scenarios and I don't know how they end. And so what I have to just pay attention to, and it's taken me a really long time to kind of grasp storytelling with still photography, because I wasn't separating the things that I can do and the techniques that I can do with a camera as a photographer to tell stories, and then like the concepts of stories. So like, you know, like conflict, man versus nature, man versus man. So like when I'm covering a hurricane, it's pretty obvious. Like a lot of times it's man versus nature. Sometimes it's man versus man. And then in another scenario like protests, that's going to be a scenario too where you might have counter protesters. And so you look for conflict. That's what I look for. If it's I guess if it's a good story, there's going to be some type of conflict of some sort involved, or someone that wants something and their process of getting it. And so identifying, I guess, like what the end story could be, I've got to think about. So is it someone wanting something? Is it conflict? And that can change.
Well, in that scenario, then, do you also look for a protagonist? Someone to kind of be that center of the story?
I don't necessarily look for them. They emerge. They come out. They're probably going to be, and I'll just use this as an example because it's happening a lot, and it's a good example of like a protest. They're going to be someone with a strong personality. They're probably a leader of some type. They're going to be someone who's out in front. They're
representative too, of what's going on.
They might be dressed in a certain way. Things the same way like with creative storytelling and fiction. I'm not necessarily like looking for them, but they show themselves to me like right away.
Yeah.
And over time, you can start to identify earlier who those people are going to be. Like, okay, this person's going to be a troublemaker. Like, if there's opposing groups, you're like, okay, I'm just going to follow this guy around. Like, when I was in Charlottesville at Unite the Right, there was one dude who, what did he have he had this long, he had a flagpole the whole time. And it looked like he had snorted like 8 lines of coke before he came out there. And he was just running
hyped up,
around, raising hell everywhere. And like half my photos are of this dude in this blue button-up collared shirt and a blue baseball helmet on because he was just raising hell everywhere. And I knew that like wherever he went, there was gonna be a conflict of some sort happening. And so you start to be able to like figure out like who your characters are gonna be, who's gonna have a prominent role. You just kind of follow them around. Sorry, that's the wrong word, because that's one thing I definitely advise people against, is not to follow people around, because then you're just photographing their back.
Right.
But to put yourself in front of them before they do whatever they're gonna do.
Well, and talk about that. There's the iconic picture from Helene of the guy standing out in front of the tower that's fallen over. Tell me about that photo.
So
you know what I'm
I've been
talking
in
about.
yes,
Yeah.
that was on the front page of the New York Times.
That was your photo?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's make that clear.
I just look. I feel like anybody who knows Sean knows that photo. But you don't. That's what I'm saying. That's why
I
I'm
don't know
introducing-
Sean. I don't know the photo.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible photo.
So I'd been in Asheville and the Biltmore Village neighborhood for maybe about an hour and a half. I had gotten there, made like 100 photos, made enough to send like 2 or 3 so that we had something from Asheville. And then that was like my second trip to where I was like, okay, now I have time to like start really getting into it. That first like send or filing
Right.
of the photos is just so they have something. And so that's when I was like, I'd just driven up from basically Florida and Georgia, and I was finally like into the meat, of why I'd made that drive
Right.
that entire day. And people in these photos, I don't realize it until like I get there and make the photos of them, but they're always just the people who live in that area exploring their neighborhood.
Right.
Like, at first I always kind of think like, oh, who is this person? And it's like, oh, it's a person who lives in this area.
Right.
So that's who that is. It's just people who lived in Asheville who were just out assessing,
Trying to figure out what in the world just happened.
what the hell had happened,
Yeah.
and see for themselves, and a lot of times too document and share. I had just pulled out my Starlink and let some people use it to call some of their loved ones for the first time. They hadn't communicated with anyone
Yep.
yet. They were running out of cash. They couldn't get the ATM scenario. So I was like, okay, I'm where I need to be for at least like the next day. So I felt good.
Yeah.
And then it was just random people wandering around, much in the same kind of way I was, kind of dumbstruck with the devastation and these giant tanks that I didn't know what was in them. That were probably 2.5, 3 stories tall, but it had been knocked over. And then there's just 2 dudes just wandering around in front of it. And, I guess that just illustrates the strength of the water that came through and that it moved this giant metal thing.
Because all of that up there was water, right? There was no wind or, like hurricane-type damage, typical hurricane-type damage.
There was wind damage, but a lot of that was in the trees. And a lot of that happened because of the earth turning into soup, basically. So it would create and probably contribute. I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing that one of the factors involved in landslides, once you get a soup of earth and then you get, strong winds pushing over
It just sort of takes
trees.
everything with it.
So a lot of it's combined, but most of the damage, especially in the Asheville downtown area, and a lot of the areas in western North Carolina were because of the water. And that typically is always the biggest killer and the biggest devastator is the water.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine, I guess that it covered New York Times is something you've gotten before.
Yes,
right?
and normally it's coverage of a storm.
Yeah. What's that like? I mean, from those of us that live here in Columbia, South Carolina, that seems like a big achievement.
It's validation that I did my job at, I guess, the basic level. And when I say that I did my job, like my job when I'm a wire photographer for Getty Images is to get my photo on the front page of the New York Times. At least that's how I think it is.
Yeah. It's a good goal.
And there's other, goals and papers that you can get on. There was one storm that I covered, and it was like 8 front pages the next day. None of them were the New York Times.
Right.
And that was a different
Yeah.
feeling. It just makes me feel like I'm doing my job, to be honest with you.
That's awesome. Well,
So I guess I've always thought that the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the major newspapers have their own photographers out there doing it.
right.
But what you're saying is you get it and you give it to Getty and then they get it from Getty?
Now, I've also covered, I can't remember, it was Matthew or Michael for the New York Times, and they will typically have, on large storms like that, at least one of their own freelancers that they've hired or a staff photojournalist that they send down that typically either lives in D.C. or New York, and they'll typically be with a reporter. And then the New York Times will have their stories from their reporters with their photographers that might be, like when we talk about like storytelling, that type of storytelling that they're doing is probably it's more long for in depth than what my role is, because they're probably following around specific people, maybe like their journey through the storm. Maybe they're staying with a fire department, riding out through the storm. They're telling typically stories of individuals or very specific people, and they do have photojournalists that provide that type of work for them. But they can't have everyone at all the places at the same time. And they may need so I'm trying to think of how this particular photo played out on the cover. Lots of times it'll be like the national or international story. And it might not, it'll be like a standalone. So the story isn't attached to it, and it'll just be like the national news. So my first cover was probably when we had our 20 inches of rain in 2015.
Yep. I remember watching your stuff from that, like just watching him kind of go through the craziness of that storm.
And that was just what's called like the standalone photo of like the caption of national news of like, here's what's going on right now. And like the New York Times also has just different print editions as well.
So how did the rights work for all that?
So
I'm assuming you have all the rights to all your photos forever?
So if I work with an entity like the New York Times, the Washington Post, according to the agreements that I remember and have reviewed, there's, I guess, an embargo might be, they have, sorry, let me use better wordage for this. They have exclusive usage for a period of time, and then I can use it afterwards. So I'll retain the copyright, but they have exclusive rights to use it if I work with the Times or the Post. If I'm working with Getty, they have the copyright, and I have limited usage rights to it. I can use it in a book, an exhibit.
So, I mean, you don't have to say if you don't want to. But how much did you get for the photo on the New York Times?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I get paid a day rate. So it doesn't matter how well I do my job, other than
they ask you to keep doing it more often if you get better.
Well, this is why I'm interested in the drive, because the thing that's what I had assumed was there was a regular rate, and it's not like if you get the one big one,
there's no bonus.
Yeah, that perception that if you get that one big one, that you're the man.
Then he can't even use it. He couldn't even make a book on Helene until the rights,
until the embargo's over. Yeah. But I think that
if he made a coffee table book about coffee,
but right, yeah. But I think that I think it's interesting that but that's not why, right? It isn't to get it on the cover of the New York Times. That's not why, right? The why is that the story needs to be captured.
Sure.
Right.
But you also need to be able to eat and pay for your.
Yeah, totally. But I think that happens, right? It kind of, I feel like if you chase that right combination of skills, and because that's the thing about democratizing of journalism, right? Is that they've still got to trudge up that road with gear on your back and a Starlink and the whole thing to be able to get it, right? And that's the differentiator, right?
And 99.9% of the population doesn't grasp these most basic things that go into it. I remember getting gas, driving up into Asheville, and someone on Facebook, why isn't the media covering what's happening in Western North Carolina? And I was like, well, I got time. And I was just like, well, we were all down in Florida.
Yeah.
Now we're all driving, like, in terms of national media. And also, too, and you got me, I could rant about this forever. But what most people also don't realize is that national media relies on local media. And a great example of this, same thing, is what about Western North Carolina? What about North Carolina when Los Angeles was on fire? And what is Los Angeles? It's like one of the media capitals of the world.
Right.
Like, there's so many people out there capturing visual documentation of that it was taking out planes and recovery efforts, dropping water, because people were flying drones and trying to document what was going on.
Yeah.
And then you had all these other logistics, like they probably also had better electricity, cell signal.
Grids and stuff like that.
And so there's always all these logistics that go into this stuff. And for the most part, the general public has no idea that that's what's involved. Like you said, that like someone has to, if it's someone with the national media, they have to, in that case, drive up from Florida where they, you know.
But so much of that storm, I mean, you know, because we were all, I mean, at least I was, Brian had power through the whole thing in Forest Acres, but like in our neighborhood, we had no power. So like, you know, we were charging our phones in our cars, but watching this happening, you know, through people's phones, right?
Yes, yes.
And because, you know, NBC News can't get a crew there to shoot it, but somebody can shoot it on their phone. And when you see somebody's shed floating down the river and hits a tree and explodes into 1,000 pieces, you're like, good Lord, like this is crazy. And I don't need anybody to interpret that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need anybody's opinion about what's happening right here. This is insane. Right. And, you know, the shots of Lake Lure, you know, those weeks after with all the debris and the boats all just like sitting in the lake basin. I mean, it's insane. But for somebody like you to just walk, you know, you drove your car as far as you could drive it and then you walked in. And that's, to me, that's like a level of ruggedness, I guess, that most people just would not take on, right? No matter how much we want to know what's going on, because we're very close to it, obviously. And, you know, we've been to Chimney Rock a thousand times. I knew all of the little street corners and, you know, I mean, everything that I saw where the road was washed out, I knew exactly where everything was. As much as we wanted to know what was going on, I'm not driving my car up there and walking through the riverbed.
It's his job.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is the drive is what makes the money happen, right?
But he has the drive. You got to have the drive to do your job well.
Right.
But if he wasn't getting paid,
well,
would he be going up there?
That's true. I don't know.
I couldn't afford it, and
it
would be, at this point, I'm not there yet, but I would have less of an excuse.
Right.
And it's a big part of it, like, especially when you start, you know, covering things like this. Like, if you're going to get up there, you better not be a tourist.
Right.
Better not behave like a tourist. And you better have a reason why you're there when someone asks.
Yeah.
Because they're going to ask. And most everyone up there was armed. And in fact, when I brought my friend, when we went up to deliver the generators, we went into town. And my friend was like, man, I'm getting like this. How did he describe it? He was just getting to look at all these different firearms that everyone was carrying.
Oh, wow.
Because
Yeah.
it was just like whatever people had.
Because it's become the Wild West, kind of like, you know,
Well, I mean,
lawless society in
It's
a
the
way.
mountains.
Yeah.
North Carolina. And
Wow.
And think about it, like you're sitting in your home looking at, you know, your phone, and they had like no idea what was going on outside of their homes. So these people would come out of their homes, come into downtown Batcave, you know, like carrying their shotguns, you know, like looking around.
Yeah.
Because there was like rumors. I got really great experience to see how those things happened. I had one group of residents telling me that there was looting going on in an area that I was at that I didn't see looting going on in. And they were saying that the fire department would admit to it because it would make them look bad. But I was in a meeting with like officials where they asked if they needed police
Yeah.
to protect from looters, and they were like, no, we're fine. You know, but the people that told me that there was looting, they didn't know that I had been
Right.
there during that time.
Right.
And I don't know if they knew the truth either. Because at the same time, someone drove by a very nice car, it was like SUV, brand new, several of them. They had flashing red lights, and they drove to an area that eventually just ended. And they're trying to figure out who was that in there. And then like by the time that the two vehicles left, like this one lady was like, it was Trump, you know, like, and she was sure that it was Trump that had just driven through.
Right. And no way to know.
Yeah. And it probably wasn't.
Not in
and
the
then,
fall.
And then every person that came up and asked, like, oh, who was that? She was like, it was Trump.
Definitely Trump, because she had decided. Yeah.
So yeah.
I think it's I think the whole thing is really fascinating, and I love watching what you're doing as far as, you know, I get to kind of follow it on Facebook, which is cool. I would love to talk about the music stuff. I think it's still important to you, right?
We'll just have to have him back on another.
Yeah, I said we have to have a part 2
Because I'm curious. I'm assuming because the ducks weren't as interesting as the car accident, you haven't done any National Geographic type photography, watching animals.
like
No.
no.
Fireflies is the closest thing.
Yeah.
That's because I live where this rare thing exists, and it's like it's very similar to the idea of like me recognizing that I have a certain role, and part of it's because very few of me are left in terms of photojournalists. When I interned at the state, there were 13 staffers in the photo department, and there are 2 left.
Oh wow.
So if that gives you an idea.
Yeah.
And there's no photo editor.
Right.
Is there a state newspaper?
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, not quite the way that it used to be, but you know.
Most newspapers are that way too.
Yeah.
So part of it is too just like realizing like, okay, like this is like why you're here. What, like this is why you don't work another job that you have to show up to part-time or full-time like I used to when it was bartending.
So you can go.
was
So you
so I
can
could
go
go-
if you for 9 days if you need to go.
Or spend, 6 hours, 5 nights in a row in the woods,
Yeah.
making photos of fireflies.
Oh yeah. Right.
But
sure.
yeah, basically I wait around all year for storms, especially at this point. And I've invested like an enormous amount of money to be able to put myself into that position to be able to do it, because I realized that was one of the very few ways that I could stand out in being a photojournalist, was to be able to
So storms, you would say, is your specialty?
Yes, 100%. I've photographed 11 hurricanes in 9 years, I want to say, and maybe 12 storms if you count the flood here. That wasn't a.
I know you don't like the snow and the cold, but have you done any blizzards?
Growing up in Maryland, I went through a blizzard my junior year in high school, and I snowboarded to get milk.
Nice. Well, we had Snowmageddon a couple weeks ago. So
That's right. Yeah.
Were
That's,
you-
that's right. We had a half an inch. It's enough to shut the whole city
I
down
ended
for
up
a
in Myrtle
day.
Beach for that.
Yeah.
And that was, once again, it's like the logistics of just trying to get like where you need to be. I was in Columbia and we didn't know where the inches were going to end up, whether it was going to be Savannah, Columbia, or Myrtle Beach. And I woke up at like 4 a.m., I think it was, or something like that, and looked at the map of what was going on, and I knew that they wanted me to be wherever there was a lot of snow in South Carolina, and it looked like Myrtle Beach. So I drove to Myrtle Beach, and that was probably one of the more fun drives I've had in a long time.
Just through the snow. Yeah.
I mean, at some points it was just a sheet of ice, but there was no traffic.
Yeah.
So it was fun.
Get to slide around a little bit and
Yeah,
not worry about it.
And that's kind of the fun parts of the job, is get to do that. And that was the weird thing with Helene, was that one of my favorite things to do is drive like back mountain roads.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I ended up doing, was having to explore these back mountain roads where it's like, I don't know where this is going to go, but it says
Yeah.
Bat Cave Road. That might go to where I'm trying to
You're trying to get to. Oh my goodness. Well, Sean, thank you so much for doing this. This has been really fun. This what I wanted is to hear the stories about this stuff. So that was really great. We always end up with the podcast with 5 questions. So we're going to ask you the 5 questions.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of a very specific Sean question. First off,
What's your favorite hurricane?
What's your I don't know that the favorite hurricane is a good gosh. No, let's skip that one. What's your favorite band? Except for the Bloodhound Gang. Can't choose that.
I'll answer like 2.
Okay.
So I'm going to say Depeche Mode
Okay.
as kind of like something that I've listened to for a long time. And then I'm just going to throw say Me Without You.
Okay. I don't know that one.
They're from Philadelphia. They don't exist anymore.
Okay.
Everyone
Awesome.
should check out
Me Without You.
that
Okay.
band, because that band
Very cool.
That band was awesome.
Favorite movie?
Seven.
Nice. That's a good one. Early Fincher.
I wrote.
I like it.
I had to write about that. I chose to write about that in media arts class.
Yeah. What's in the box? Yeah, that's a great one. My wife saw that once and she said she never wants to see it again.
I watched it a lot of times.
I could see it over and over again. I don't understand, but she got freaked out by that one.
I mean,
Yeah, so I totally get it. What's your favorite season of the year?
fall.
Fall, because of hurricane season.
That. And then I have really bad allergies.
Oh, okay.
So spring,
Yeah.
not much into. And I'm not into the cold. So
Gotcha. Let's pick back up with favorite TV show.
okay.
All right.
So I'll give 2 for that. Same thing, like something from early on. Band of Brothers.
Okay.
And then, and similar but not really, I'd been watching Rogue Heroes,
Okay.
which isn't as serious, but it's also about World War II,
Okay. Nice.
but about the Brits,
Okay.
about crazy Brits specifically.
Nice. That's awesome. Did we get? Was that 5? One more. What would your last meal be on death row?
Probably a cheeseburger.
Yeah, man, after my own heart. Cheeseburger. That's great. Well, Sean, thank you so much. I
Welcome.
appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.